When most people hear the word pirate, a very specific image appears in their mind. A weathered face beneath a tricorn hat, a cutlass at the belt, a black flag snapping in the wind above a wooden ship somewhere in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. Maybe a peg leg, maybe a parrot, maybe both. We know this image. We grew up with it. Films, novels, theme parks, and television series have spent decades polishing it into something almost mythological. And that, precisely, is the problem. Because the real pirates of the Caribbean were something far stranger, far more complicated, and in many ways far more interesting than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. This is the story of how piracy in the Caribbean actually began. Where it came from, who built it, why it exploded, and why it eventually collapsed. And along the way, you might find yourself reconsidering everything you thought you knew about the most romanticized criminals in history. To understand pirates, you first have to understand sugar and silver and the particular kind of greed that grips powerful nations when they watch a rival grow richer than themselves. When Spanish explorers reached the Americas in the late 15th century, they stumbled upon something that would reshape the entire world. Not just new land, new wealth, staggering, almost incomprehensible wealth. Gold and silver pulled from the earth in quantities that had no precedent in European experience. Tobacco, sugar, resources that flowed back across the Atlantic in the hulls of Spanish galleons and landed in the coffers of the Spanish crown, making Spain the undisputed superpower of the age. The rest of Europe watched and seethed. France, England, the Netherlands, all of them seafaring nations with imperial ambitions of their own, saw the Spanish Empire expanding and knew that if they fought Spain directly in Europe, the cost in blood and money would be catastrophic. But Spain's colonies in the New World, those were vulnerable. Those were far from home. Those were, in the eyes of rival European governments, ripe for the taking. And so they found a solution that was elegant in its cynicism. Rather than declare outright war, they quietly issued letters of marque, official documents that gave private sea captains legal permission to attack and rob Spanish ships and settlements. These men were called privateers. They were, in every practical sense, pirates. But because they had paperwork, they were technically something else. The French went first. Jean Fleury, François Leclerc, Jacques de Sores, names that terrified Spanish merchants and colonial governors throughout the 16th century. They raided treasure fleets. They sacked settlements. They carried off fortunes and handed a percentage to the French crown, which smiled politely and asked them to please continue. England followed. Sir Francis Drake, Sir Richard Hawkins, Sir Walter Raleigh, men who are remembered today as national heroes, explorers, adventurers, men who were, by any honest accounting, state-sponsored pirates operating in foreign waters. They too were enormously successful. They too terrorized the Spanish. And they too had to eventually sail home to Europe, because neither England nor France had a permanent base in the Caribbean from which to operate. That would change. And when it did, everything escalated. Around 1625, a small group of mostly French settlers arrived on the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, the large island shared today by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They weren't there to build an empire. They were there to survive. They hunted wild animals and smoked the meat over wooden frames in a technique borrowed from the indigenous people of the island. The process was called boucan. The people who did it became known as buccaneers. in English, buccaneers. At this point, they were hunters, not pirates. But the Spanish, who considered all of this territory their exclusive property, had other ideas. Colonial governors ordered raids to drive these settlers off. Crops were burned, shelters destroyed. The buccaneers were forced off Hispaniola and relocated to the small nearby island of Tortuga, a name that means turtle, and which would soon become the most dangerous address in the Western Hemisphere. Then the Spanish attacked Tortuga too, and then the island of St. Kitts. And in doing so, they made a catastrophic miscalculation. They turned hunters into pirates. By around 1630, the buccaneers of Tortuga had made a collective decision. They had no land they could keep. They had no crops the Spanish would allow to grow. They had nothing to lose. And just offshore, Spanish treasure ships were making their slow, heavy way back toward Europe, riding low in the water under the weight of silver and gold. The choice, for men with nothing, was not a difficult one. They attacked, they plundered, they survived. The Spanish attempted to remove them several more times and failed each time, because with every raid, the buccaneers came back stronger, angrier, and in greater numbers. English, Dutch, and French settlers, who had been harassed and displaced throughout the Caribbean, gravitated toward Tortuga, drawn by the only community in the region that was actively, successfully fighting back against Spanish dominance. In 1640, a French engineer named Jean Levasseur arrived on the island and built something that changed the balance of power entirely. Fort de Rocher, a fortress with a commanding view of the harbor, bristling with cannon, capable of repelling any naval assault the Spanish could mount. In exchange for a share of captured treasure, Levasseur offered safe harbor to pirates of any nationality. Tortuga became the first true pirate port in the Caribbean, and the buccaneers, who now called themselves the Brethren of the Coast, began to organize. What they built was, by the standards of 17th-century society, surprisingly democratic. Before each voyage, crews elected their captain. They drafted written codes of conduct, articles, that governed everything from how treasure would be divided to how misconduct would be punished. The captain received the largest share, but every crew member received something according to their role. Surgeons and carpenters were valued. Ordinary sailors were compensated fairly. Captains who were deemed incompetent or abusive could be removed by vote. In an era when most working people had essentially no rights whatsoever, when sailors in legitimate navies were flogged, starved, and paid almost nothing, the pirate articles represented something genuinely radical. A social contract, written by the people it governed, for their mutual benefit. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it will matter again later in the story. Meanwhile, in 1655, England captured Jamaica, and at the southeastern tip of that island, a small settlement called Port Royal began its rapid ascent toward becoming the most infamous city in the Caribbean. The English governor of Jamaica understood immediately that his colony needed defending and that he didn't have the resources to do it alone. So he extended an invitation to the Brethren of the Coast. Come here, use this port. We will look the other way regarding your activities, in exchange for your presence as a deterrent against the Spanish and French. The pirates came, and Port Royal became something extraordinary. The most famous figure to emerge from Port Royal's buccaneering era was Henry Morgan, Welsh-born, ruthlessly ambitious, tactically brilliant, and not particularly interested in the fine print of his legal authorization. Morgan was issued letters of marque to attack Spanish shipping, but promptly extended his ambitions to include Spanish settlements, Portobello in 1668, Maracaibo in 1669, and most famously, Panama City in 1671. A raid so audacious and so profitable that it earned him a vast fortune, a brief imprisonment in London for attacking a country England was no longer at war with, and ultimately a knighthood from King Charles II. History, as it often does, rewarded the man who won. Other great buccaneers followed: John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, John Sawkins, men who in 1680 launched what became known as the Pacific Adventure, an operation of staggering ambition that involved crossing the Darien Gap on foot, allying with local indigenous tribes, attacking a Spanish fleet in Panama Harbor, ransacking the city, and then sailing all the way around Cape Horn back to the Caribbean. It reads like fiction. It actually happened. By the early 1690s, Port Royal had a population of roughly 6,500 people. It was one of the most prosperous settlements in the Western Hemisphere. It was also, by all accounts, completely extraordinary in its depravity. A contemporary observer recorded that wine and women drained the pirates' wealth so thoroughly that some died in poverty, having spent fortunes within days of returning to port. Taverns ran day and night. Wealth changed hands in quantities that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it. Port Royal was, depending on your perspective, either a monument to human freedom or a warning about what happens when there are no rules at all. On June 7th, 1692, a catastrophic earthquake struck. The northern half of Port Royal sank beneath the sea within minutes. Thousands died. The city never fully recovered. But by then, the era of buccaneering was already ending. Peace with Spain meant fewer letters of marque. Infighting along national lines fragmented the brethren of the coast. The European powers, having used the pirates as weapons against Spain, now found them inconvenient and began recruiting the most experienced sailors into their own navies. The plantation economy of the Caribbean, built on enslaved labor and sugar, had no room for the egalitarian chaos of pirate society. Anti-piracy laws were introduced. Port Royal, once a safe haven, became the place where pirates were publicly hanged. The remaining diehards turned their attention elsewhere. The Indian Ocean, the trade routes of the East India Companies, the treasure ships of the Mughal Empire. This became known as the Pirate Round, a vast, dangerous circuit from the Caribbean around the Cape of Good Hope and into the wealth of the eastern seas. Henry Every, one of the most successful pirates of this period, sailed his ship into Nassau Harbor in the Bahamas in 1696, loaded with plundered treasure, and found that the underpopulated, poorly defended English colony there was not only willing to shelter him, but actively grateful for the protection his presence implied. Nassau would remember that. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, it created a crisis that nobody in authority had planned for. Thousands of private ears, men who had spent years attacking enemy shipping with official sanction, suddenly had no official enemy, no income, and no prospects. The legitimate navies and merchant fleets that might have absorbed them offered brutal conditions and near starvation wages. Nassau, meanwhile, offered something different. What emerged there in the years between roughly 1715 and 1725 was the most remarkable experiment in pirate society the Caribbean had ever seen. The Pirate Republic, a loose but genuine confederation of crews and captains, governed by the same kind of democratic articles the buccaneers had developed 70 years earlier. A community that drew not just displaced privateers, but demobilized Navy sailors, escaped slaves, free black sailors, and anyone else for whom mainstream society had offered nothing but exploitation. Of the estimated 5,000 pirates active in the Caribbean during this period, historians believe almost 1 in 3 were of African heritage. That number deserves emphasis. In a world built on the violent subjugation of black people, the Pirate Republic offered something genuinely, materially different: democratic governance, equitable distribution of plunder, and freedom from the social hierarchies that defined every other institution of the age. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of this era, expressed the appeal with characteristic bluntness. In honest service, he said, there were thin rations, low wages, and hard labor. In piracy, plenty, pleasure, liberty, and power. A merry life and a short one, he concluded, shall be my motto. Among the pirates who gathered in Nassau, a particular group rose to prominence: the Flying Gang. Led initially by Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings, it eventually included Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Stay de Bonnet, Sam Bellamy, Mary Read, Anne Bonny, and the man who became the most famous pirate in history, Edward Teach, Blackbeard. The Flying Gang began, somewhat patriotically, by targeting only French and Spanish vessels. But the volume of English merchant traffic in the Caribbean eventually proved irresistible. Crews complained to their captains that they were passing up too many easy targets, and so the restraint ended. Ships of all nations became fair game. The response from European governments was swift and ultimately decisive. In 1717, King George I of Britain issued a royal proclamation offering pardons to any pirate who surrendered and swore to abandon piracy. The King's Pardon, as it became known, had limited initial success. So in 1718, George reissued it, and simultaneously appointed a man named Woodes Rogers as the new royal governor of the Bahamas, with a clear mandate to end the Pirate Republic by whatever means necessary. Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in July 1718 and immediately blockaded the port, trapping Charles Vane inside. Vane escaped, barely, and threatened to return with Blackbeard to retake the island. He never did. The remaining pirates in Nassau accepted the pardon. Rogers began rebuilding the fortifications, and, when the local population proved too unaccustomed to authority to cooperate, turned to a characteristically pragmatic solution. He hired ex-pirates to hunt their former colleagues. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founders of the Pirate Republic itself, took the pardon and went to work for Rogers, pursuing the men he had once sailed alongside. It was ruthlessly effective. One by one, the great pirates were caught. Stede de Bonnet was hanged in Charleston in 1718. Calico Jack was executed in Port Royal in 1720. Charles Vane's luck ran out in 1721. Blackbeard chose to fight rather than surrender, and was killed in combat by a pirate hunter in November 1718. A battle so violent that, according to contemporary accounts, he took 5 bullet wounds and over 20 sword cuts before he finally fell. Between 1716 and 1726, approximately 500 pirates were executed. Their bodies were hung in chains at the entrances to harbors, left to decay as warnings to anyone considering a similar career. It was a message delivered with considerable emphasis. By the end of 1721, piracy in the Caribbean had been effectively destroyed. What remained was the legend, and the legend, as legends do, grew in the telling. The tricorn hats and the Jolly Roger, the theatrical accents and the plank walking, most of it is invention. There is no historical evidence that Caribbean pirates spoke in any particular distinctive way. There is no documented case of anyone being made to walk a plank. The romantic iconography that fills our films and novels is largely a creation of 19th century fiction writers who found the raw material of real pirate history and decided it needed embellishing. It did not need embellishing. The true story of Caribbean piracy spans nearly a century of extraordinary complexity. Politics and religion, colonial ambition and economic desperation, racial diversity and democratic experimentation, lives of staggering violence and occasional moments of something that looked almost like justice. Real people making real choices under real pressure, in a world that had given most of them very little and offered them, in piracy, one chance at something else. Remember them not for the myths. Remember them for the articles. Those democratic codes of conduct, hammered out on the decks of wooden ships by people whom official society had written off, who nonetheless insisted on building something fair. That insistence against all odds in the middle of one of the most brutal centuries in human history is the real legacy of the pirates of the Caribbean.